Father Flame, you touched my wee-wee. Father Flame, you touched my wee-wee.
We are talking Agnes, directed by Mickey Reese, who also co-wrote the movie. On the surface of this, you might be thinking, it's yet another horror nun movie on the back of the Conjuring franchise. And while there is a degree of that, it's actually something a little different. So let's discuss. But I will say this review is going to be slightly spoilery. I will try to avoid specifics about the plot. But the reason I would say this is going to be a spoiler review, because this movie has two distinct halves, and as such I'm going to have to talk about the second half, which clearly comes after the first. So in that respect, I'm going to have to talk about some plot details. So there you go. What is the story here? Well, initially it focuses on this convent where one of the sisters seems to have been possessed by some type of demonic entity. This is Agnes. And we learn that they are, this is a very out of the way kind of convent with very kind of strict rules. And it is called upon this priest who has been accused of doing bad things with children to try and do this exorcism. Now the interesting thing with this is that this guy has done exorcisms before, but he's never really actually believed that these people were possessed. And he's kind of like, just thinks they were needing some type of almost like placebo type reassurance from, spiritual cleansing and stuff. But most of the exorcisms he's done, he thinks just have pretty much been people who have been in a dark place kind of mentally. He's joined by a young kind of trainee priest who is yet to take his vows, and they go to this kind of convent, meet the nuns, and we're introduced to a couple of different ones, the Mother Superior, Agnes, the girl who was possessed. And one of these nuns is called Mary, one of the minor characters in the first half. And then obviously we have the attempt at an exorcism. So that's your first half of the movie. The second half of the film is completely different. It literally stops halfway through the movie. We get a time jump, and then we have more of a straight drama from the point of view of Mary, who was a minor character in the first half. One of the nuns in this convent, who after this somewhat of a time jump has left the convent and is now living in this city trying to make ends meet. And that's story. So there's a little bit of connective tissue between the two, but not a lot. So it's a bizarre film, and actually feels like it should be two films, to be honest with you, where one film is a somewhat art house horror film, we'll talk about a little bit more, and then the second one is more of just a drama. But instead we have two 45-minute films combined into this one story, which has two distinctly different halves and even characters, to be honest. Okay, so let's talk about what I think works in this movie. So let's just again, we'll take it half by half. So the first half of this movie, the actual I would say more horror elements, it's a weird stylistic choices here. And as I've said, this has some art house sensibilities. There are some sequences and shots here that seem very off kilter and bizarre at times, almost like it's a parody or a comedic elements to it. But they're only very quick sequences here and there that seem, to be honest with you, somewhat out of place, but it gives you this weird art house feeling, but it still has a coherent story, if that makes sense, and interesting characters. Some of the stylistic choices via filmmaking as well will harken back to the filmmaking of the 70s. There's quite a few snap zooms and things like this that will remind you of the nunsploitation movies of the the 70s era and things like that, which was quite good. I actually quite enjoyed some of the in-depth characters we got. Are what we believe to be, at least, as our main character, this main priest. We learn he's been accused of kiddie fiddling at the end of the day, but it's never confirmed one way or the other if he's actually done it. We just know he's been accused of it. And then there's kind of like these kind of young kind of trainee priests kind of reaction to it, and their sort of relationship, the relationship between them and the very, very kind of uptight Mother Superior, and these kind of group of nuns who seem to have varying degrees of kind of, faithfulness to the kind of the church and things like that. So I did think there was some good sort of character work there, and then the kind of the second half, again, I have to say, I think the character work is interesting and solid. I feel like we could have got to know the characters a bit, albeit it's kind of in a completely kind of different movie. And we were introduced to new characters here. One played by Sean Gunn, brother of James Gunn, who is this kind of stand-up comedian that kind of Mary maybe has a little kind of a thing with, things like this. So I think the character work is fairly good, and I have to say the acting on both sort of halves of the movie also is kind of pretty much on the good side. There are some kind of weird elements here that I feel are done for artistic choices that may undercut some of the kind of the serious acting, but I think the acting, to be fair, was good by everyone really kind of involved here. I actually thought the setup for the kind of the first half of the movie was pretty decent, and these kind of, we've seen plenty of possessed nun movies and priests going to try and exorcise them and stuff, but I thought it at least had a little bit of a kind of a flavour of it, and I quite like the way this priest was, he was an experienced exorcist, but kind of like didn't actually believe that they were possessed with demons. I thought that gave a kind of a somewhat of a new perspective on this kind of the kind of relationship between an exorcist and a kind of like the person being exorcised. I thought it was somewhat kind of unique, and his kind of like more anti-authoritarian kind of attitudes towards the kind of the church. Again, I thought that there were some elements there that could have been somewhat new to the genre, and the exorcism itself. Some other characters that are introduced that were interesting, but I didn't feel were necessary. And it's kind of, again, it's not really like an exorcism movie that you've seen. And then again, the second half is, I guess, would be a potentially interesting drama about a girl who has seen something traumatic at church and has kind of like lost her faith or given it up. But it's weird. They don't really meld. That kind of leads me to what doesn't work is that this is such a kind of a left turn, really, when we get to that kind of like that halfway mark, and it literally fades to black. We get a time jump and we see Mary sometime on working in a supermarket, and she's barely introduced in the kind of the first half, to be honest. So it's not as if she's the kind of like a major player in that first half. So it's very strange. It's a strange decision. Some of the kind of the weird sort of choices that were made in more the first half to try and have this weird kind of off-kilter element, this kind of almost comedic, somewhat art house feel to it. Again, I didn't feel was necessary. It just had these random kind of little 2-3 second sequences where I think, what's going on there? What's that all about? But there's not many of them so it just seems an odd inclusion. And then, as I mentioned, we have characters that are introduced that really don't seem to have much relevant on the plot. To me, this movie as a whole just feels like lots of things kind of chucked in together, lots of kind of like random micro storylines that don't really seem to have any real sort of purpose, and just kind of thrown together to make this kind of like one half possession movie and the second half a kind of slice of life drama. Such a weird choice. Now, without actually telling you what the ending is, we have to talk about the ending. I actually understood what the ending. I feel most people here will be very dissatisfied with the ending. Now, if you listen to the conversation that immediately precedes the ending, I think you can kind of understand where it was meant to be going. But nonetheless, it's a somewhat unsatisfactory ending for many, I would suggest. And then kind of like, is it scary? Is this movie a horror film when it's in its kind of like its first half? Not really. I mean, to be honest with you, the girl who's possessed just looks like she's got a whole bunch of hairspray on. It kind of just looks like that. This is what I mean. It had these weird. She's like wheeled in on this wheelchair at one point, and all she's got is this like huge, like, which looks like 80s glam metal hair, and that's kind of like why has that happened? You know, there is some reasonable. There's a couple of kind of like bloody moments that I thought were well handled, but it's just this film is clearly what the director's vision wants it to be, if that makes sense. This is clearly the idea of the film that he wants to make. Have this weird, off-kilter film which starts out one thing and ends being completely different. A commentary maybe on certain things, religion and what we put our faith in and how we view other people and such. But is it accessible to people outside of the filmmaker itself? That is the question. And there are some elements, like I said, I do think the acting is good. I think it's, you know, it's well shot and everything, and I think the character work is very good, and it introduces some elements that I feel make it somewhat unique, even outside of the weird kind of like half and half storyline and the weird art house sensibilities. But it's such a bit of a kind of a jumble at the end of the day. It kind of just feels disconnected. I mean, we don't really know Mary, who's the kind of the focus of the second half. And then we kind of want to know what happened to the characters in the kind of the first half. And then we do get a little bit of kind of exposition about that, but you know, I don't know if it really works, to be honest with you. I'll give this one a 5 out of 10. It has some interesting elements, and it is at least a reasonably well crafted movie on a kind of like technical scale, but for a narrative entertainment, I feel it's really lacking and kind of like misguided. 5 out of 10. Have you seen it? What do you think of it? Leave me a comment, and I'll look forward to seeing you next time. Bye for now.